You could argue that Japan's just a few decades ahead of the West, and we're going to end up living the same sort of story. There's some good arguments for why that's true and some good arguments against it. It's a popular debate that I follow quite a lot, but I'm not so sure it's helpful because the risk of the West being different and doing something different is quite high. And I think Japan was by itself over the last 20 or 30 years in its lived experience, whereas the West is sort of, they're all in it together as they move down this path and becoming more and more like Japan. There's also the fact that we've had this big burst of inflation recently, which is not very Japanese at all.
Hello and welcome to the Tin Hat podcast. I'm Jasmine Birtles and I'm joined today by my friend Nick Hubble. I say friend, we've never actually met, Nick, have we?
So many years now.
Yes, you're on totally the other side of the world. You were in Australia. You are and you have been for a while the editor of the Fortune and Freedom newsletter, which comes out of South Bank Investments. But now you're doing it from Japan, is that right?
That's right. So I've moved here just to try and keep the kids bilingual, Japanese and English. Obviously, my wife's Japanese, so we're sort of back with the locals. This is where we spent the COVID pandemic for the most part, actually. We escaped just, I think, the day before the second lockdown in London and moved here. So we're sort of back and forth between English-speaking countries and Japan. Yeah, but this is cost-adjusted the best place in the world for the quality of life.
That is amazing to me because I grew up with the idea that Japan was expensive. You know, Japan has been an economic force for some time, and now you're saying, and certainly in one of your recent articles, you said that Japan is really cheap to live. Really cheap to live in?
Yeah, it's very difficult with Japan to untangle what is odd about Japan just because the culture is so different, and what's odd about Japan because their financial and economic situation is so bizarre that people in the West have to sort of explain it away by saying, oh, that's just Japan, it's different in Japan, the same rules don't apply in Japan. But there's all of these bizarre impossibilities that really boggle the mind, the Western mind at least, that just don't make sense to us, but which are perfectly normal here in Japan. For example, they had persistent deflation for a very long time, meaning that consumer prices fell and people would get pay cuts each year, but the money in their pocket would be worth more over time. And that obviously radically shifts the way people think about money. They save more because money holds its value better. They use cash because the money in their wallet doesn't devalue. A bit like the Germans, actually, who are also very much anti-inflation. And they don't speculate as much in stock markets and other financial markets anymore. They see houses as a depreciating asset, a bit like a car. So people, when they buy a home, they usually commit to it for about 30 years and they can't leave because if they try and sell the house, they take such a big loss on that sale that they can't afford it effectively. So everything is radically different. And a lot of the divergence from the West, a lot of the shift happened back in the 80s or the very end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s, when Japan went from having what looked like the greatest Western style economy in the history of Western style economies, from free markets and so on, having this extraordinary boom where everything was unbelievably expensive, to a huge crash, a stock market crash that lasted about 25 years from memory. This beginning of this period of deflation that I described, and just an all-out rout of what it meant to be Japanese. And none of that makes sense in the model or the framework that Western people and Western economists use when they talk about money and economics. So, for example, Japan's debt-to-GDP ratio is impossibly high. According to any sort of Western economy rules, it shouldn't be able to sustain that debt to GDP. And like I say, it's impossible to distinguish whether that's because Japanese culture and Japanese people are so different that they've got like a siege mentality about this and they're willing to sustain that debt mentality, or if there's something else going on in terms of their bizarre economy and their bizarre economic management.
Yeah, because we had Tim Price on the podcast earlier, and he said the debt to GDP ratio is something like 260%. I mean, the British one is bad enough, 110%, but 260%. to me, from what you've been saying, that kind of decline essentially, and that level of debt to GDP, gross domestic product, that should, I would have expected that to create huge ructions, social upheaval, revolutions, but we've barely heard about it over here in the West.
Yeah, when you're analyzing and trying to understand financial markets, ever since 2008 for sure, but probably before that, you always have to consider not just what is happening in financial markets or what might happen next, but also what the policy response from governments and central banks might be. And you've almost got this, I've forgotten the movie, but there's two tsunamis that sort of crash into each other and they sort of negate each other, and you're sort of left with a calm sea. That's sort of what's happening in financial markets is you've got this tsunami of debt and inflation and interest rates and all these crazy problems. And sort of been this tsunami has been raised to try and counteract it in terms of government and central bank policy. And just as Japan is the most absurd and extreme in terms of its debt to GDP ratio and several other factors, it's also the most extreme and absurd in terms of what central banks and the government have done about it to
Yes.
try and keep things under control. So the obvious simple example is that the Central Bank of Japan, the Bank of Japan, owns a huge chunk of the Japanese stock market. About 7%, I believe, of Japanese stocks are owned by the central bank, which is just a totally bizarre scenario. But an even better example is that the Bank of Japan owns more Japanese bonds for a given set maturity than exists in that maturity. So, for example, you've got a bond that matures in, say, 2030, and the Bank of Japan, the government of Japan has issued, say, 100 billion US dollars worth of that. The Bank of Japan owns, say, 110 billion dollars worth, which is supposed to be impossible, right? So the absurdities to try and keep that interest bill on that interest rate on that government debt under control has reached mind-boggling, impossible, like theoretically impossible levels, and that's what's kept things under control. What makes this moment in time so interesting is Japan is trying to leave
Yes.
that extreme amount of control. I think for the first time since their debt levels become so impossibly large and out of control in of itself. So they've raised interest rates from a negative territory, meaning that when you borrow money, you get paid to borrow it. At least the Japanese banks do, but to a positive level. So for the first time, the borrowers in the economy have this positive interest rate, which is at debt to GDP of 260 or whatever percent it might be, really quite dangerous.
Mm.
And the question is whether the economy, especially the government, can afford positive interest rates, and whether other factors like GDP growth and inflation will sustain it at a high enough level to make that interest rate affordable.
Mm.
I would say it's unlikely given the demographics of
Yeah.
Japan being so bad. I just don't understand how the economy can grow faster than the debt rate than the debt, given a positive interest rate. So I think this is very strange because the last 40 years in Japan have been a strange experiment, and everyone's describing the end of the strange experiment as the Bank of Japan is staging this experiment, but it's really just an attempt to return to normality.
Yeah.
So the question is, like you say, whether all these impossibilities in the debt level and something that shouldn't mathematically work, whether that can survive in something closer to a real world, which the Bank of Japan hasn't allowed for so long.
Yeah, you've touched on so many things there. For example, the actual state of the demographics in Japan,
Mm.
because growth, you need young working people, and they're not happy about immigration. So going forward, as you say, I wonder how the growth would happen. Although on the other hand, I am aware that there are many very good businesses in Japan that are doing well, and the stock market's pretty decent, actually.
Yeah, the stock market's rise is a bit odd and a bit mysterious. But a big part of the explanation is that the value of the yen has fallen so much, and that makes Japanese exporting businesses very successful. It rose from an absurdly and extraordinarily low level. So as I'm sure Tim Price would have told you about, the valuations of the Japanese stock markets were extremely low, meaning they were cheap. So for every pound of profit, how much you paid as an investor to effectively own that pound of profit, it was cheap compared to all the stock markets around the world, which is why I know Tim has been very interested in Japanese stocks for a very long time. So they only just hit record highs that previously they saw in, I think, 1989, I believe. So it's an extremely long time to wait, but it's absolutely skyrocketed, as you say. So it's difficult to understand whether the stock market is signaling that something is very good or something is very wrong. For example, during the Weimar Republic, the German stock market went bananas, and the Venezuelan stock market's gone bananas, and the Zimbabwe stock market's gone bananas. It's because there's something really wrong. It's possible that the Japanese public are really worried about these positive interest rates and inflation and are deciding they're better off owning Japanese stocks than they are Japanese government bonds because of this potential for a crash. A crash that, by the way, effectively has occurred in the UK and the US and most other places. So if Japan gets that same inflationary shock and has to raise interest rates as much, the Japanese government would be toast. And I don't know what the Bank of Japan would be doing about it.
No, quite. Just to go sideways for a moment, you mentioned the US and British stock markets effectively crashing. That I mean, US stock market seems to be doing quite nicely, but certainly Europe and Britain they're anemic at best. How is it that you're saying that there's a sort of a crash in effect?
Well, I meant bond markets, but also, funnily enough, it's inflation adjusted there effectively has been a crash. So if you think about what the value of money actually is, I've seen since the inflation began in 2021, how much currencies have devalued. Well, stock markets haven't kept pace with that, apart from possibly the US, but that's only about 7 of the stocks, the key stocks there that have pushed up the broader market. The bond markets are what have really crashed. And there's much bigger losses there, much more important ones. So as interest rates as interest rates go up, bond prices fall. And if that were to happen in Japan as well, that would be what's really dangerous, because of the amount of debt outstanding, the value of those bonds, the interest on the government debt, that would all amount to huge losses and an unsustainable debt situation. We don't quite have that in the UK and the US yet, because I suppose you at 100% debt to GDP, just to make the maths easier, if your GDP is growing faster than your interest rate, so your interest rate is 3%, your GDP growth rate is 3.1%, then the debt is sustainable, right? Because over time, your GDP is growing faster than your debt burden.
Yeah.
But as soon as the interest bill is growing faster than the GDP, then you're in trouble. And so, as you mentioned, that immigration becomes the key factor and demographics become the key factor. Unless you get a government of the sort we have in Argentina now, where genuine reform actually does happen and productivity actually does dramatically rise, which I don't see happening in Japan or the UK or the US.
Do you not see it happening simply because of the demographics, or is it just politics and the way society is working here?
Well, the incentives for the demographics are the opposite, right? Because you've got the aging population voting for stability and no reforms. They don't want to raise the pension age, for example. The key issue with productivity is, first of all, the government has to get out of the way, which, I mean, I would never have expected that Javier Milei would be elected in Argentina as an anarcho-capitalist. Funny enough, which I am. I thought that ideology that I share is way too unpopular to ever be elected anywhere. Now he's the president of Argentina. So it's possible that that does happen. We get something even more extreme than, say, Thatcher and Reagan, but just a Thatcher and a Reagan would be good at this point. One that actually keep the government debt down. But the other part of productivity is investment in assets that produce and improve productivity, therefore. So machinery and better research and development, R&D. And what you see in Japan is that investment has fallen steadily over a long period of time, which is why their productivity has fallen as well, which is why they're in trouble. And there's very few countries around the world that have sustained a high level of investment. China's actually sustained too high a level of investment. But there's very few around the world, in Western economies especially, that have sustained a high amount of investment in their economy. Investment in this case meaning in actual stuff that makes people more productive. Um, I wouldn't be investing in things that make people more productive, given how much of a barrier the government is in doing that. It doesn't exactly help businesses start up, for example, by getting rid of all of its stupid regulations. Maybe those two things therefore do come in tandem at some point. But I think the lesson from Argentina is that you can spin it in a positive way or a negative way. The lesson is either that people do eventually wake up and realize what is needed, despite the fact that in Argentina for so many decades now, anything libertarian or free market would have been dismissed. You can also spin it in the negative way, which is things have to get really bad before people wake up to what is needed. I don't
Yeah.
know which of the two people want to choose.
Well, I do wonder, back to Japan, if people are beginning to wake up there. As you say, the bank is trying to do something. Whether that will cure or kill, frankly, is well, we're still going to see. But how do you see things panning out? I mean, if things crash, because it does feel like that there's it's a massive bubble there, as it is here, but I think possibly worse in Japan. If you just need one thing to happen, come from outside, who knows, some sort of
Hmm.
an earthquake or something like that, some big event that makes things fall apart. um, how do you see that potentially panning out in Japan, and what could that do for the rest of us in the West, for example?
The thing about an external shock like a pandemic or an earthquake or something like that is it gives the central bank an excuse to intervene very heavily in financial markets and support the government in its spending. What you need to have a genuine crisis is a surprise of the sort, like we saw in 2008, where it's not quite obvious initially what the big risk is, right? So
Uh-huh.
when the subprime housing bust started in 2006, it was just a few places that had falling house prices. And the central banker in charge at the time, Ben Bernanke, said, don't worry, house prices on a national level have never fallen. We don't need to worry about it. And house prices started to fall on a national level. And still, people didn't quite realize what it meant. And there's all these dominoes had to fall one after the other. And it took more than a year before it was truly a financial crisis. And it was the failure to grasp just how significant and severe it was till it was too late that made that crisis so bad. So there's that to think about. More interestingly, in Japan, the bubble, as they call it here, they use the English word bubble, that happened in the 70s and 80s and ended in about 89. It was so big and so extreme. You would have heard that statistic about the Emperor's Palace in Tokyo being worth more than all the real estate in California combined, or something along those lines. The bubble was so extreme and so absurd and so severe, and the crash that followed so terrible. You can't talk about it because a lot of people committed suicide over the losses in the stock market. I learned that the hard way. It was such an extreme event that they now associate those reckless booms and busts in a very negative way, right? So if you say to a Japanese person, stock markets go up in the long run, that's probably quite a rude remark because they don't believe it. It's not true to them. That's not their lived experience. And when people start speaking in those sorts of terms and phrases, they get very nervous and uncomfortable. If you say to them, house prices rise in the long run, same thing. They know it's not true. That's not their lived experience. They get very uncomfortable about it. They think you're nuts, basically. So for them to have any sort of boom now, it would almost be like they would just doubt it so
Mm.
much, and they would have so much skepticism and so much fear of the bust that inevitably follows a boom that they know it's a bubble. From the whole point of bubbles is you don't know it's a bubble at the time. So when house prices go up unbelievable amounts, people at the time said, don't say this is a bubble. They only say that after the bubbles burst. In Japan, they will identify it as a bubble beforehand, I believe, and they'll understand that it's not a great outcome. So that's why we've had so many booms and busts and booms and busts in the West, while Japan's just had this sustained, they call it a lost decade, but it was about three. So the lived experience was so different that it's very difficult to translate how it would play out differently here.
Mm.
You could argue that Japan's just a few decades ahead of the West,
Mm.
and we're going to end up living the same sort of story. There's some good arguments for why that's true and some good arguments against it. It's a popular debate that I follow quite a lot, but I'm not so sure it's helpful because the risk of the West being different and doing something different is quite high.
Mm.
And I think Japan was by itself over the last 20 or 30 years in its lived experience, whereas the West is sort of they're all in it together as they move down this path
Mm.
and becoming more and more like Japan. Um, there's also the fact that we've had this big burst of inflation recently, which is not very Japanese at all.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, you've talked about that bubble, and what seems to have been in the last 30 years, you say the last decade, as it were, 30-year decade, seems to be the opposite of a bubble. So this sort of big trough,
Mm.
which is also perhaps not being talked about or not being faced
Mm.
quite as much as it should be. And that because that trough is unsustainable as well. Ultimately, I would have thought, 260% or thereabouts debt to GDP ratio is fundamentally unsustainable, and yet it has been sustained. But that something has to give at some point, I would have thought.
But it was the trough that made it possible for the Bank of Japan to intervene to the point where the debt to GDP ratio could rise to such an absurd level.
Wow.
So if the trough ends and the Bank of Japan loses its justification for keeping the government's finances stable, because it can only intervene in financial markets while inflation is very low, under the cover of low inflation supporting the Japanese government's financial position. If that trough ends and inflation starts to pick up, which it seems to be what's happening now, then the Bank of Japan's justification for intervening and supporting bond markets starts to erode. And the question is whether the Japanese government, with its absurd debt to GDP ratio, can survive, on its own 2 feet. And so that's the bizarre situation here, where can the Japanese government survive what should be a return to normality? You could think about it in terms of a drug addiction, right? There's this 30-year drug addiction to 0% interest rates, free money, lots of support from the Bank of Japan, all sorts of bizarre, crazy government central bank policies. They came up with QE back in the day for so many decades now. After all of that, what does a financial system without all of that support look like? So it's perfectly plausible for me, as I see it, to say something like Japan's going to be the epicenter of the next great financial crisis because, as it turns out, you can't sustain an economy with sort of 60% government debt to GDP and have anything but extraordinary monetary policy at the same time.
Yeah. And I think that's where that's where we need to finish it, because ultimately that is the what could potentially happen. Japan could be where the next sinkhole starts. It sounds like a sort of whirlpool, a sinkhole situation, financially.
Yeah, there's two ways that governments can respond and central banks can respond if things start to blow up. Because we could go back to that old system where the Bank of Japan tries to support the the status quo. We go straight back to that trough, or we get some sort of inflationary burst, which would be a real shock to Japan, especially. But it would signal that there is actually an end to the road, where eventually central banks just overdo it and have to support the government too much just to keep the government alive, and it does cause all that inflation that everyone's been worrying about from QE for all these years.
Because I guess if they don't do something quite radical like that, then the big fear is that their big neighbor, China, the hated China, could come in and take over, I would assume.
Yeah, I don't know if they're actively worried about that. That would be an interesting one. I think the Japanese people are so insular that they care a lot more about themselves and their own stability and their own perception of themselves rather than foreign invasion. Effectively, they've outsourced their defense to the US for so long
Mm.
um, that they haven't really thought too much about their self-defense until very recently with lots of government spending, which again increases the GDP ratio. So they're not really getting anywhere fast there.
Ah, well, Nick, let's talk about this again in a year's time, and let's see how Japan has gone and how the rest of the world has managed. Because as you say, it does feel a bit like Japan is a little further down the road than the rest of us. We could, who knows, we could follow that track. Hope not, but you never know in these times. Nick, it's been great having you. Thank you so much. This has been Nick Hubble, editor of Fortune and Freedom, which comes out of South Bank Investment, discussing the Japanese economy and how it could affect the whole world economy. Now, if you enjoyed this, do like, do share, do subscribe, all the usual things, and tell all your friends how much you love it.